In the depths of the Northwoods, veiled beneath an ancient canopy of pine and cedar, lies a network of trails known only to the most daring adventurers. These paths wind through the heart of the forest, where the light barely touches the ground and the air holds a chill even in the heat of summer. Among these trails, the Lost Creek Path is the most notorious, famed not only for its beauty but also for the disturbing stories that hikers whisper upon their return, if they return at all. Eli Turner, an experienced hiker with a penchant for the supernatural, was drawn to Lost Creek Path by the tales of those who had ventured before him. Stories of disappearing trails, ghostly figures in the mist, and an eerie feeling of being watched had circulated in the hiking community for years. Armed with nothing but a backpack, a camera, and an insatiable curiosity, Eli set out one crisp fall morning to uncover the truth. The trail began innocuously enough, with chirping birds and the gentle rustle of leaves underfoot. However, as Eli ventured deeper into the forest, a silence began to settle around him, oppressive and dense. The air grew colder, and the path, clearly marked at the outset, became increasingly difficult to discern among the overgrown brush and fallen logs that littered the ground. Several hours into the hike, Eli noticed something odd. His GPS device, which had been tracking his progress, suddenly showed him as stationary, even though he was clearly moving forward. He looked up, expecting to see the sky, but a thick fog had descended without warning, obscuring the treetops and casting the forest in a ghostly pall. "This is how the stories start," Eli muttered to himself, a shiver running down his spine not entirely from the cold. He continued forward, his steps cautious, his eyes scanning the dimly lit path that seemed to twist and turn back upon itself unnaturally. As evening approached, Eli realized he should have reached the end of the trail hours ago. The map had shown Lost Creek Path as a straightforward 6-mile loop, but he had been walking for nearly 8 hours. Just as panic began to set in, he heard a faint sound carried on the breeze, an ethereal humming, soft and melancholic. Drawn by the sound, Eli veered off the path, pushing through a dense thicket until he came upon a clearing. In the center stood an old wooden cabin, its windows dark, its structure barely preserved amidst the encroaching wilderness. The humming was louder now, and it seemed to emanate from inside the cabin. With a mix of fear and curiosity, Eli approached the cabin, his candle ready. He tested the door, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung open with a haunting creak. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with just a table, a chair, and a dusty old bookshelf filled with books that looked decades old. The humming had stopped, replaced by a palpable silence. Eli walked over to the bookshelf, examining the titles. Most were on local flora and fauna, but one book caught his eye, a leather-bound volume titled Legends of the Northwoods. He pulled it out, and the moment he did, a cold draft swept through the cabin, extinguishing his lantern and plunging him into darkness. Fumbling for his flashlight, Eli turned it on, only to find that the room had changed. The furniture was gone, replaced by what looked like an altar, covered in strange symbols and dried herbs. On the floor in front of the altar lay a circle of stones, inside which were ashes that looked disturbingly fresh. As Eli stepped closer, the temperature dropped sharply, and his breath became visible in the air. He could see his breath forming frosty clouds in front of him when suddenly the humming began again, louder than before, surrounding him, suffocating. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, searching for the source. That's when he saw her, a figure standing at the threshold of the cabin, her appearance ghostly pale, her eyes hollow and black. She pointed at Eli, her mouth moving silently, as if cursing him or warning him. Eli, heart pounding in his chest, raised his camera and took a picture, the flash illuminating the cabin for a brief, startling moment. When the light faded, the woman was gone, and the humming ceased. All that remained was the sound of Eli's heavy breathing and the wind whispering through the cracks in the cabin walls. Realizing the danger he might be in, Eli grabbed the leather-bound book and hurried out of the cabin, desperate to find his way back to the trail. But as he stepped outside, the fog was thicker than ever, and the path he had come in on was nowhere to be seen. Lost and disoriented, Eli frantically tried to retrace his steps, but each turn and step he took seemed to only lead him deeper into an uncharted wilderness. Trees that once stood silent now seemed to groan under the weight of unseen burdens, and the air grew oppressively cold, biting through his clothing and chilling his skin. As night fell, the forest around him became eerily silent, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of nocturnal creatures, just a suffocating stillness that pressed in on all sides. Every now and then, a faint rustle or a shadow moving in the periphery of his vision suggested he was not alone. Panic setting, his mind racing with thoughts of the ghostly figure and the haunting humming that now seemed to echo inside his head. Desperate for any sign of the path or a way out, Eli continued to stumble through the darkness, his flashlight's beam growing dimmer as the batteries started to die. Suddenly, ahead in the darkness, a small light flickered. Hope surged through him, and he hastened toward it, only to find a lantern hung on a tree branch, swaying gently as if someone had just placed it there. The sight was unnervingly peculiar, a lantern in the middle of nowhere, but it was the only light he had seen since leaving the cabin. Approaching it cautiously, Eli noticed a narrow trail leading away from the lantern, barely visible beneath the undergrowth. With no better options, he decided to follow it, the lantern in his hand casting eerie shadows that danced around him. As he walked, the air grew inexplicably colder, and his surroundings seemed to shift subtly, the trees bending unnaturally close, as if to whisper dark secrets. The trail twisted and turned, looping back on itself, each turn disorienting him further. Then, through the dense trees, he heard a sound that made him freeze, a low, mournful wail that rose and fell with the wind, a sound full of sorrow and longing. The wailing grew louder, more desperate, and Eli felt an overwhelming sadness wash over him, a grief that was not his own but pressed down upon him with oppressive weight. The sound seemed to draw him forward, leading him through the thicket to a small clearing where the moonlight filtered through the branches, casting a pale glow over the forest floor. In the center of the clearing stood an old, gnarled tree, its trunk wide and branches sprawling like the arms of a giant. Hanging from the tree, twisting slowly in the wind, was another lantern, its light flickering weakly. Beneath the tree, a figure was slumped against the trunk, its features obscured by shadow. Eli approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, the figure raised its head, and he saw it was a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow with despair. She looked at him with a haunting intensity, and when she spoke, her voice was like the wind through dead leaves. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, release me." Eli stepped back, the book he had taken from the cabin heavy in his backpack. "Who are you? What happened to you?" The woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but only a series of choked sobs came out. Then, gathering her strength, she whispered, "I am bound to this place, cursed to relive my grief until someone breaks the cycle. The book you carry, it has the power." Eli's mind raced. The woman's plea echoed the warning of the ghostly figure in the cabin. He realized that whatever malevolence lay in the forest, it was tied not just to the land but to the suffering of souls like hers, trapped between worlds. "I will help you," Eli said, his resolve firming. He removed the book from his backpack and began to flip through the pages, looking for anything that might help him understand how to break her curse. As he read aloud from a passage marked by an ancient symbol, the air around them began to stir, a gentle breeze at first that grew into a howling gale. The woman's form began to shimmer, her outline blurring as if she were made of mist. She looked at Eli, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Thank you," she mouthed, just as the wind seemed to lift her, dispersing her form into the night air, leaving behind a feeling of peace that hadn't been in the clearing before. Relief washed over Eli, but the peace was short-lived. As he turned to leave the clearing, he realized that the path he had followed was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of thorns and underbrush. The forest was not done with him yet. His intervention had altered something fundamental, and the balance of the cursed would sought to restore itself. With the book in hand and the lantern flickering its dying light, Eli knew he had to delve deeper into the mysteries of the Northwoods if he ever hoped to find his way out. As the moon cast a silvery glow through the branches, Eli sensed the forest watching him, its unseen eyes tracking every move he made. The stillness was palpable, filled with a tense anticipation as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Armed only with the dim light of his lantern and the ancient book, Eli pushed forward, his boots crunching softly on the leaf-strewn ground. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig heightened his anxiety, feeding the fear that something, or someone, was perpetually at his heels. The deeper he ventured, the more the environment around him seemed to warp and twist. Trees bent unnaturally, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky, while the path underfoot swirled in patterns that made his head spin if he looked too long. It was as though the forest itself was alive, breathing and pulsing with a dark energy that sought to disorient and swallow him whole. His mind racing, Eli tried to focus on the content of the book, flipping through the weathered pages for any clue or incantation that might offer protection or a way out. His flashlight flickered over a page adorned with a complex symbol, a circle encompassed by intricate runes that pulsed with a strange familiarity. He stopped, feeling a vibration through his fingers as they traced the symbol. The air suddenly grew colder, and a dense fog began to rise from the ground, enveloping him in a white shroud that dampened his sight and sound. His heart pounded in his chest as he felt the isolation of the fog, cut off from the world he knew, enveloped in a realm where the boundaries of reality seemed to blur. A low hum, barely audible over the beating of his own heart, began to resonate through the fog. It grew in intensity, a mournful drone that seemed both foreign and disturbingly familiar. Eli's breath caught in his throat as shapes began to form in the mist, shadows at first, then clearer figures of people, dozens of them, all dressed in garments from another time. They circled around him slowly, their faces expressionless, their eyes hollow. As they moved, they spoke in unison, their voices a chilling blend of accusation and lament. "You have opened the path," they intoned, but not yet the gate. What enters must also exit. What is bound must be released. Eli, surrounded and overwhelmed, struggled to understand their words. What gate? How do I close it? He shouted into the fog, but the figures continued their relentless march, paying no heed to his pleas. Desperate, Eli turned back to the book, his hands trembling as he paged through it under the dying light of his lantern. There, amidst a passage on gateways and crossings, he found a reference to the circle with runes, the same symbol he had traced. The circle of return, he read aloud, his voice steady despite the growing dread. Used to seal the passage between realms. To activate, one must recite the oath of closing at the heart of the disruption. Eli looked up from the book, realizing what he needed to do. The heart of the disruption, the cabin where it all began. He needed to return there, to the place where he first encountered the ghostly figure and the unnatural cold. With a new sense of purpose, Eli forced his way through the encircling specters, who seemed to part slightly, allowing him passage as if recognizing his intent. The fog began to dissipate as he retraced his steps, guided by a deep, instinctual pull towards the cabin. The journey back was torturous, fraught with eerie silences punctuated by rustles that seemed to follow him, always just out of sight. Finally, the dilapidated structure of the cabin came into view, its windows dark, its facade more menacing than ever under the pale light of the moon. Eli approached the cabin, each step heavy with the weight of what he was about to undertake. He entered, the air inside stale and cold, as if untouched by time. Drawing a deep breath, he opened the book to the page with the circle of return, laying it flat on the old wooden table where he had seen the first apparition. He began to recite the oath of closing, his voice echoing through the empty rooms, mingling with the whispers of the past. As he spoke, a wind began to rise within the cabin, swirling the dust and leaves that had accumulated over the years. The temperature dropped, a palpable chill settling over everything, seeping into his bones. As he uttered the final words of the oath, a scream tore through the cabin, a sound so anguished and raw that it shook the very walls. The wind reached a crescendo, the old timbers groaning under its fury, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. Eli stood frozen, the book clutched tightly in his hands, his heart pounding in the deafening quiet. He waited, fearing to move, fearing that the slightest sound might shatter the fragile peace. Minutes passed, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. Finally, daring to breathe, Eli glanced around. The cabin seemed unchanged, the dust motes once again floating lazily in the shafts of moonlight that pierced the gloom. But the oppressive atmosphere, the chill that had seeped into his bones, was gone. In its place was a feeling of emptiness, a void left by the absence of the malevolent force that had haunted the place. Relief washed over Eli, mingled with an exhaustion so profound it made his knees buckle. He sank to the floor, the book falling from his limp grasp. His eyes drifted closed, and he might have fallen asleep then and there, had a sudden sound not jolted him back to alertness, a sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Scrambling to his feet, Eli grabbed the book and rushed to the window, peering into the darkness. The moon had been obscured by clouds, casting the forest into shadows. He could just make out a figure moving at the edge of the clearing, its movements too fluid, too quick to be human. A cold dread filled him as he watched the figure pause, then turn towards the cabin. Its face was obscured by darkness, but Eli felt its gaze on him, piercing and intense. The figure took a step forward, then another, its form becoming clearer as it approached the lights coming from the cabin windows. It was the woman from the mirror, her appearance no longer spectral but vividly real, her eyes glowing with an inner light that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. She stopped just outside the window, watching him with an expression that was impossible to read. "Why are you here?" Eli called through the glass, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The woman tilted her head, considering his questions. You have unbound what was bound, she said, her voice a chilling blend of many voices, male and female, old and young. The cycle is broken, but the path remains open. You have opened doors that lead to many roads. This is only the beginning. The beginning of what? Eli demanded, a shiver running down his spine. The woman's lips curled into a semblance of a smile, but it was devoid of warmth. Of your journey, Eli Turner. You have shown great strength and courage, but there are many more trials ahead. You must choose your path wisely. With those cryptic words, she stepped back, blending into the shadows, disappearing as if she had never been there. Eli stood at the window, his mind reeling, trying to process her words. The path remains open. More trials ahead. What had he unleashed by breaking the cycle? As he pondered these questions, a soft rain began to fall, pattering gently against the cabin roof, whispering through the trees that swayed in the gentle breeze. It was as if the forest itself was sighing in relief, or perhaps in anticipation. Eli knew he couldn't stay in the cabin. He had to leave to find answers. With one last look around the small room that had been the center of such profound events, he stepped outside, the book tucked under his arm. The rain had washed away the last traces of the oppressive atmosphere, and the air smelled fresh and clean. But as he made his way back through the forest, the path now clear under his feet, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The woman's words echoed in his mind, a warning and a prophecy. His journey was far from over. This was only the beginning, and he needed to be ready for whatever lay ahead. The forest seemed to watch him go, the trees whispering among themselves, the wind carrying their secrets. Eli walked on, his heart heavy but his step determined. Whatever trials awaited, whatever paths he had to choose, he would face them head-on. After all, he was no longer just a hiker or a seeker of thrills, he was a guardian of secrets, a walker between worlds. And as he emerged from the forest, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Eli knew that his next steps would take him deeper into the unknown. But he was ready. For the darkness, for the light, and for the myriad mysteries of the Northwoods that awaited his exploration. As Eli left the shadowed embrace of the Northwoods, the early morning light passed long, stretching fingers across the land, dispelling the last remnants of night. The dawn chorus of the forest birds began, a natural symphony that contrasted sharply with the supernatural quiet he had experienced in the depths of the woods. With each step away from the forest, the events of the night began to feel more like a distant dream, surreal and fragmented. However, the weight of the leather-bound book under his arm served as a constant reminder that what had transpired was all too real. The cryptic warning of the woman, her final words about his journey just beginning, echoed in his mind, a persistent whisper that wouldn't be silenced. Eli knew that despite his desire to return to normalcy, his life had irrevocably changed. He was no longer merely a seeker of the unknown, he was now a keeper of profound and dangerous secrets. Determined to seek guidance and perhaps find others who had experienced similar encounters, Eli drove to the nearest town. There he found a small, inconspicuous coffee shop where he could gather his thoughts and plan his next moves. As he sipped his coffee, staring out the window at the waking world, he opened the book once more. This time, his focus was drawn to a section about guardians and sentinels, beings who had, across various cultures and eras, protected the boundaries between worlds. The more he read, the more Eli understood the magnitude of his new role. It wasn't just about confronting spirits or breaking curses, It was about maintaining the balance between the natural and the supernatural, ensuring that neither realm encroached too far into the other. The realization was daunting, but Eli felt a resolve building within him, a determination to rise to the challenge he had unwittingly accepted. As he formulated a plan to learn more about his duties and perhaps find allies, a woman approached his table. Her appearance was unremarkable, but her eyes held a depth that immediately made Eli cautious. She introduced herself as Mara, and without any preamble, she said, "I know what you've been through, Eli. And I know what lies ahead." Eli tensed, his hand instinctively closing around the book. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "I'm like you," Mara replied, sliding into the seat across from him. "A guardian. I've been watching your progress since you entered the Northwoods. You handled yourself well, but the path you've started on is more dangerous than you can imagine." Eli studied her, trying to discern if he could trust her. "Why should I believe you?" he asked. Mara smiled, a wry, knowing expression that unnerved him. "Because, Eli, you're going to need all the help you can get. The book you found is just the beginning. There are more like it, more secrets to uncover, and more threats to confront." She then told him about a network of guardians, each responsible for a different geographical area, but all connected by their common duty to protect the veil between worlds. She offered Eli guidance, training, and resources to understand the broader scope of his role. The conversation stretched for hours, and by the time Mara left, Eli felt less isolated and more a part of something much larger than himself. He spent the next few days in the town, making plans, researching, and occasionally meeting with Mara to learn the fundamentals of his new responsibilities. Finally, ready to take the next step, Eli packed his gear, including the now invaluable book, and set out once again. This time, he wasn't just a lone hiker seeking thrills, he was a sentinel embarking on a journey to guard the fragile seams of reality. As he drove away from the town, the sun setting in a brilliant display of oranges and reds, Eli felt a mix of anticipation and fear. Ahead of him lay challenges and dangers, but also adventure and a purpose greater than he had ever imagined. Behind him, the town faded into the distance, its lights twinkling like stars against the twilight sky. Ahead, the road vanished into the gathering darkness, a symbol of the unknown paths he would travel. Eli knew that whatever awaited him, he was ready to face it, armed with knowledge, supported by allies, and driven by a duty to protect. The world might never know his sacrifices, his struggles, and his victories. But as night enveloped the road ahead, Eli drove on, a silent sentinel in the endless battle between light and shadow, forever vigilant, forever bound to the hidden truths of the world he now guarded.